It's time I use this channel for its highest possible purpose, and that is to make big sandwich. Today I'm going to be making tortas. It's going to be a pretty involved process. I'm actually going to split the work over a couple days, so it's a bit more of a weekend project here, but I promise you if you try it out, you will be rewarded greatly by the end of it. The first phase of torta prep I'm going to tackle is to cook my meat. I'm going to be braising a pork shoulder in the oven. So the first step of that is to create my braising liquid. So that's going to start here with this onion I got. I'm just going to slice it thinly, pole to pole. This is probably the default way that I tend to chop up onions. But you're going to see that this onion's going to get blended up eventually. So don't get too hung up on how you slice it up or anything like that. Just get it into small enough pieces so that you can saute it. So that's going to go into my Dutch oven with maybe just about a tablespoon of vegetable oil, and then I'm going to continue on prepping the rest of my ingredients, the next of which is going to be some garlic. Again, this is all going to get blended up eventually, so I'm not going to be too particular about how I slice this up or break it down or anything like that. I'm just going to crush it and get it into relatively small pieces so that I can saute it. I'm going to push that garlic off to the side for now. I don't want to put it in the pot yet because it would probably burn by the time the onions had enough time to saute. So I'm going to leave that on the board for now, and I'm going to start prepping my next ingredient, which is going to be some dried chilies. Today I have a mix of guajillo and árbol chilies. All I'm going to do with these here is rip the stems off and try to get as much of the seeds and the seed pods out as possible. It's okay if I don't get all of them out. But I want to get the majority of them out if I can. And in the process of doing all this, I'm going to rip the chilies into maybe 1 to 2 inch pieces. Guajillos are a pretty mild chili, so you can use quite a few of them. And I want them to be kind of the main flavor that's going on in the braising liquid there. So I'm going to use probably about 4 of those. The árbol chilies are not mild. Those are pretty spicy, so use those with a little bit more caution. I'm only going to use a couple of them. The onions are taking on a bit more color than I meant for them to, but that's okay. I'm just going to turn the heat down a little bit, and I'm also going to add a small pinch of salt. The salt's going to help draw moisture out of the onions, which in the short term at least should help impede the browning a bit. Okay, now that my onions have a good head start on everything, they're pretty well softened, I'm going to go ahead and put my chilies into the pot so that they can toast with the onions in that fat a little bit. I'm also going to put in some whole cumin and coriander at this point. I'm not even bothering to grind them up or anything like that. I just want to toast them, and then it's all going to get blended up anyways, so they'll be fine. I'm going to toast all of that until the chilies and the spices become really fragrant, and then I'm going to go in with my next couple ingredients, which is going to be about a tablespoon, maybe 2, of tomato paste and the garlic. Once I get the tomato paste evenly mixed into there and it has a chance to brown a little bit, I'm going to put in a chipotle packed in adobo sauce. Chipotles and adobo, if you don't know, are smoked jalapeños canned with a vinegary sauce. I had already used about half the can for previous meals, so that's why I have the rest of it in this Tupperware here. I'm only going to add 1 of these chilies and then a little bit of the sauce with it. I find that if I add too much smoky stuff to this mixture here, the end product ends up tasting a bit more like an American style kind of barbecue, which is good, but it's just not what I'm going for here. So I try to keep it light on anything that has smoke in it. Finally, I'm going to add some chicken broth into the pot, basically just enough to submerge everything. After this is all blended up, I want the final mixture to be relatively thick so that it kind of coats the pork shoulder. So I want to be careful about the amount of liquid I add up front. And besides, I can add more liquid to adjust later if I need to, so I'm going to keep it light up front. I ended up adding about half of this carton of broth. So I'm going to let this simmer now for probably around 10 or 15 minutes, basically enough time for the peppers to rehydrate and soften up a bit so that I can blend them. Meanwhile, I'm going to set my oven to 300 degrees. I'm gonna start considering my pork now. I got about 5 pounds of bone-in pork shoulder here. I'm gonna go ahead and salt it on the board. The reason I'm doing it this way and not in the pot or anything like that is because I find it way easier to visually gauge this way how much salt to add. I know I can pretty heavily coat the outside of this in salt, and this is just the easiest way to kind of see that without having to just kind of guess at how much to throw in the pot with everything else. Anytime I'm working with raw meat, I'm always trying to consider how many things the meat is going to touch and how many times I'm going to be touching it with my hands. So now that I'm done salting it, I'm gonna wash my hands and then I'm not gonna touch it again with my bare hands. I'm gonna use a pair of tongs from here on out. I find that this type of practice makes it easier for me to stay organized and considerate when it comes to matters of cross-contamination. All right, my peppers have softened up here, so I'm gonna go ahead and blend this together. You could transfer all of this to a countertop blender if you want to. I never really like the prospect of trying to dump a bunch of hot stuff into a blender, so I'm just gonna do it with the stick blender in the pot. I'm gonna try to get this reasonably smooth, but I'm not gonna go crazy with it. If there's still tiny flecks of stuff in there, that's fine. All right, that looks good to me there. So I'm gonna drop my pork shoulder in now, and I'm gonna kind of roll it around in that sauce just to get it evenly coated. And that's really it for the pork. I'm gonna throw the lid on and put this in the oven. Now I'm gonna let this go in a 300-degree oven for probably about 4 or 5 hours, and I'm gonna turn it over every once in a while so that every side gets a chance to kind of bathe in all of that sauce. I'm basically gonna cook this until I can grab the bone with a pair of tongs and pull it out cleanly, and then I'll shred it up and save it for tomorrow. Meanwhile, I'm gonna do one more little bit of prep today. Which is going to be to roast a couple jalapeños. I do this directly over the flame on my stove. I'm going to let those go, turning them over occasionally until they're both pretty much completely charred on the outside. All right, that one looks pretty good there, so I'm going to put it into this Tupperware with the lid on so that it can steam a little bit. The steam's going to help release the skin later. This other jalapeno is close, but I can still see a good amount of green on the outside, so I'm going to let it go a little while longer. All right, that one looks good. So I'm going to pack it up in the Tupperware with the other one, and I'm going to leave them on the counter for a little while to cool down, and then I'm going to throw it in the fridge, and I will come back to them tomorrow. It's the next day now. So I'm gonna prepare the rest of my ingredients, the first of which is gonna be some beans. Probably could have done this step yesterday, but that's okay. I'm just gonna go real lo-fi on some refried beans. I'm gonna put this can of black beans, liquid and all, into a pot with a little bit of water, and then I'm gonna season them up with pepper and some oregano. And I'm gonna put these over the heat, and I'm gonna start mashing them up. Traditionally with refried beans, you would add fat, like pork lard or something, but with the pork that we prepared yesterday, the sandwich is already going to be so fatty that I'm not even going to bother here. I'm just going to mash them up with some liquid to get it into a reasonably thick, kind of smooth paste. In addition to the masher I have, this is a good job for a rubber spatula so that you can really scrape stuff off the bottom to make sure none of your beans burn. Here's my jalapenos from yesterday. I'm going to go ahead and prep one of these for my sandwich here. I'm going to just scrape the charred skin off the surface. Don't run it underwater in order to do this, because what you're going to do is you're going to wash away all of that kind of charred flavor, and that's kind of why we roasted them in the first place. We want some of that. So I'm going to scrape off the majority of the skin, but I'm intentionally going to not really do that great of a job. I'm going to leave a little bit of it there because some of that flavor is nice. So once that's done, I'm going to cut the top off the jalapeno and split it down the middle, and then just scrape out the seeds and ribs from the inside, and that'll be it. I want big slabs of jalapeno on my sandwich in the end, so that's all the prep I'm going to do. Next is some iceberg lettuce. I'm basically going to slice this as finely as I can with my very modest knife skills. Now's a good time to check back in on my beans. I'm just gonna keep giving these a mash a little bit as they come up to temperature. I'm also gonna taste them for seasoning now. I didn't add any salt up front, and that's because canned beans tend to have a lot and a very variable amount of salt in them. So I wanted to mash them up first and get them to this point before adding any salt. Here I did decide it needed a little bit more salt, so I added a pinch. Continuing with the prep, I'm gonna shred some cheese. Here I have some Oaxaca cheese. I'm using that because it's super melty and goes really gooey, which I think is gonna work really well on this sandwich. If you want that kind of effect and can't find Oaxaca or wanna use a different cheese, you can always use something like a Monterey Jack or even a mozzarella if you wanted to. My beans are looking pretty good now, but they're still kind of loose. Because they're going to be going on a sandwich, I do want them to be kind of stiff so that they don't just make a complete mess. So I'm going to let them go a little bit while longer. The bread I'm going to use for this sandwich is going to be a telera roll. I got these from a Mexican bakery down the street from me. If you're not fortunate enough to live very close to one of those, you can always just use any sort of soft roll from the supermarket. I'm gonna prep an avocado now. I'm not really gonna make a guacamole or anything with this. I'm just gonna mash it together with some lime juice and some spices. I'm gonna add a good amount of lime juice because this sandwich is gonna be really rich and I pretty much want as much acidity on it as I can get. Yeah, so I'm just gonna add salt and pepper and then half a lime's worth of juice to this avocado and then mash it up. My beans have thickened up nicely now, and they're going to continue to thicken as they cool, so I'm going to shut the heat off of that now and push it to the back of the stove for later. Alright, with all of my accompanying elements basically done now, it is time to fry up my meat for this sandwich. I'm going to add a little bit of olive oil to my cast iron pan, basically for no reason other than the oil will act as a bit of a temperature gauge, so I can see when it starts to shimmer. And then I'm going to turn my attention to my pork from yesterday. So as you can see, all I did was cook this until the bone came out cleanly, and then I just shredded it up, let it cool on the stove for a couple hours, and then threw it into the fridge overnight. I'm going to mix this up a bit because, I mean, you can see right now with all that fat and gelatin in there, it's kind of a solid block. So I'm just going to hack it apart a little bit with this wooden spatula just so I can work with it a bit. And once my pan is hot, I'm gonna form a patty with this shredded pork. This is one of the reasons I like to do this the day ahead of time, is that it makes this patty forming a lot easier. The chilled fat kind of holds everything together and will make the sandwich in the end much more cohesive than if I just took it straight out of the oven and tried to do this. So I'm using my bun there as kind of a visual guide for how big this needs to be. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger than I would think, mostly because there's a ton of fat in this that's just going to render off, so it's not quite as much meat as it looks like it would be. So I'm going to set that into my cast iron skillet to crisp up on the first side now. While that gets going, I'm going to start building the rest of my sandwich. The first layer on the top and the bottom is going to be some garlic aioli that I made. Maybe I should show you how to do that sometime. Maybe that's what shorts are for. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'll do that sometime if I can figure out how shorts work. But it's basically garlic flavored mayonnaise. This has an egg in it, so it's pretty similar to mayonnaise. You can do it without egg, but this one has egg in it. Next layer on the bottom is going to be my beans. I'm going for a pretty restrained amount of this. I'm going to be adding a pretty restrained amount of basically everything because there's going to be a lot going on this sandwich and too much of any one thing. It's just going to kind of slosh around and be a big mess. This sandwich is going to have no structural integrity if you add too much. On top of that goes my shredded lettuce. At this point, I can smell that the pork has browned nicely, so it's time to flip. It's really important that when you do this, because this is a pretty fragile mixture, to move very quickly and with confidence. You really just got to scoop it up as fast as you can with the spatula, and then flip it as swiftly and precisely as you can. If you take too much time with this step, it's going to fall apart and it's going to be harder to put on your sandwich. All right, that went pretty well there. So I'm gonna go ahead and add my cheese on top. I'm gonna sprinkle this on and not be super careful about where I get it. If it gets in the pan, that's okay because brown cheese tastes good too. So I don't mind having a little crust of that on the edges. All right, gonna continue building the rest of my sandwich. Gonna add some pickled red onions on top of my shredded lettuce here on the bottom bun. Maybe I should make a short for how to make pickled red onions sometime too. I should really figure those out. Gonna throw a lid on the pan just to help the cheese melt. It's basically warmed through and as brown and crusty as I want it at this point, so I'm just waiting on the cheese to melt. So I'll go ahead and spread some avocado on the top half of my bun. And my cheese is looking nice and melty now, so I'm gonna get my dismount platform ready, which is gonna be a plate with some aluminum foil on top. You'll see why I'm using that in a minute here. And now the trick to this, again, is to just move as swiftly and fluidly as you can. I'm gonna sort of push everything together to try and keep it as cohesive as I possibly can, but then you really just have to scoop it up with confidence and not hesitate, just go for it, and it should come out okay, and you should be able to slide it onto your sandwich without too much hassle. All right, now on goes my roasted jalapeños. And then my top bun. And now this is gonna seem like a really minor step here, but I'm gonna wrap this up in tin foil and then let it rest for about 3 to 5 minutes. What this is gonna do is it's gonna help the bread kind of steam through, and all the juices and all the fat from the pork are gonna sort of seep through all of the veggies and into the beans. It's gonna make everything much more cohesive. If you bit into it now, it would definitely just kind of fall apart on you. But what we're looking for is to create a more unified goo, if you will, inside this sandwich, and just letting it steam and rest is going to help you accomplish that. Now would be a good opportunity to get a head start on some of the dishes and cleanup. You're not gonna wanna move for a little while after eating the sandwich, so it's better to do it now than later. As an aside, if you have anybody in your home who doesn't eat pork, you can do basically the exact same thing with this jackfruit here. All right, it has been 5 minutes and I am ready to eat my sandwich. So I'm gonna cut straight through the foil. I suggest you eat this kind of like you would a burrito, where you just sort of peel the foil back as you go. All right, let's go in for the taste test. This is the best sandwich I've ever made myself, guys. You should really try this one. I went through a couple rounds of testing with this sandwich, and I really feel like I got it exactly where I wanted. I'm so happy with how this came out. I could eat these forever if my body let me. And even if you don't want to make the sandwich yourself, please just go find a torta and get it for yourself and eat it. They're so good. It's such a perfect food. They're amazing. And if you do want to try making this one for yourself, let me know in the comments how it goes. I'd really love to hear about it. Thanks.